I've gotten the nod from Kim Presnell. Thank you, Kim. I want to just acknowledge her idea of bringing it over to the library, thinking about it over here, this new space, a little more room for us, bringing everybody here to the center of campus. Maybe if you haven't been for a while, the business college is a little bit on the edge of campus, so this is hopefully a fun experience for everybody. I'm Ryan Baxter, Associate Dean of Faculty, Scholarship, and Administration. So now you know why I'm speaking here. This is about research today. Also want to give a shout out to Allison Wild, who helped and developed the program, so you can follow along for our presenters today, and for my de facto little committee here, which is Kate Watson, our marketing manager, Perrin Blakely from development, and Anna Hamby, who will speak at the very end, who's our keynote speaker. I relied upon them to bounce ideas off about how we should organize this. So it's taken us about 10 years in COBE, and we're ready to talk to the outside world, okay? It's almost been 10 years that we've been doing dialogues internally, and we've increased the number of them. Thank you, Diane Schooley-Pettis, who's here. I can't say I replaced her, but I'm following after her. Her long legacy as Associate Dean, who started a lot of the events that we do now in COBE about research, which is a research share day, which was mainly internal to us, getting each other excited, finding out what other faculty are doing within the college, and sometimes inviting others across campus. We also do a weekly brown bag, and you are welcome to come if you guys would like, interested in those topics. I can send you the emails of what faculty speak for 30, 40 minutes, dialoguing back and forth about their research. What we haven't done is really express what we think is impactful and relevant to society from our research. And we think we've got a lot that we can share, and we would like to share that today. So, we have a great lineup, very appreciative. I just sent out a call, they just responded. We looked through it and said, that looks really good. So they've volunteered. I did not force them to come up here. They're excited to share their research with you in lightning talk fashion. So a few ground rules. There's no Q&A. We know you're smart. We know you have really good questions. What we'd like you to do, instead of impressing everybody with your amazing questions, go find the faculty member afterwards and engage with them. Find out about their research. Find out what else they're exploring. What's next? What do they need to make their research maybe better? How could they partner with business, with community, with leaders in our community? Okay, so no Q&A, and we'll end it up, and that will get us through pretty quickly. We'll go lightning round fashion here, 5 minutes. I might be timing, but I think they're gonna do it. I think they're gonna do a great job. So, Rafael Ribas, our leadoff hitter here. Economics.
Should I be on stage?
Right here.
Oh, right.
Right here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Rafael Ribas, Department of Economics at COBE. And today we're going to talk about part of my research. And part of my research is we explore the impact of free tuition policies in higher education. So you may have seen the news that some of the leading universities in the US, they're offering free tuition, as for example, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, the University of Texas. So my research is, we try to answer this question is, what's the impact of this type of policy in the long run in some students' life? So you look at outcomes like, for example, earnings when you're in your 30s, in your 40s, in your 50s, criminal behavior after you graduate from college, entrepreneurial behavior, if you're more likely to start a company or not, and your probability of getting into a leadership position in the future. So you look at like variety of outcomes, and then you see, is there any impact of giving free tuition to a student in a leading university? So this question is very hard to answer because you cannot just compare students who are admitted to those universities with free tuition with students that are not admitted. Because as you can imagine, those students are way different. So what I'm going to try to do here, I'm going to focus on a very specific setting in which you can try to pin down what's called like the causal effect. And that's something that you tell the students most of the time, like when you teach statistical methods, pay attention. Correlation is not causation. Right? So we're going to use a design that tries to resemble what's something that's very close to a lab experiment, but using real data. Okay? So because of this very specific design, there's a very specific context in which we're estimating those effects, which you're gonna take data from students that apply to a leading university in Brazil, very selective university, only accepts 10% of the students. And this university offers, basically charges no tuition fee. So what I'm gonna do in the end, I'm gonna look at the admission score of those students, and I'm gonna look right at the cutoff, of the admission cutoff, and I'm gonna see what's the difference between students with like 1 decimal point above the cutoff with a student with 1 decimal point below the cutoff. In the long run, those students should be the same. Okay, it's just a matter like they were unlucky during the exam. For some reason, they got 1 question wrong, so they're not admitted to the program. So in the long run, 10 years later, 20 years later, the only difference that comes up from comparing those 2 students is the fact that one of them was admitted and the other wasn't because of a decimal point. Right? So when I do this comparison, and I'm sorry for the picture, but this basically shows, I like to use my own pointer because it's green. So what it shows here, and I cannot actually see the pointer. So what it shows here is essentially, I don't want to compare these students that are far from the cutoff with these students that are 2 above the cutoff. What I want to compare is those students right here. Those who just got in and those who just got out, okay? So, and what do I find when I compare those 2 types of students? I find that 10 years later, the earnings of low-income students increased by 24%, which is a quite significant effect. But then when I look at the high-income group, which also get a tuition, a free tuition, they don't show any impact. They don't show any effect. What does that mean? What's the interpretation of this? Well, it means that low-income, like high-income students, if they're not admitted to a program or to a selective university, they still can find a way to get their higher education with a good quality, right? But for low-income students, it's much harder. So there's this gap in the private sector for higher education in which low-income students cannot find the same opportunities if they're not admitted, meaning that their top choice is very far from their second choice in terms of quality, right? And then you go 1 step further, and for example, estimate effects are also in criminal behavior. And what's also interesting that for both groups, high income and low income, you see a reduction in criminal behavior 10 years later. And what's interesting about this effect is that the effect comes from programs where the students from different socioeconomic backgrounds interact with each other. So basically saying that if you take a high-income student and you put in a program with a large share of low-income students, that's the student going to reduce the criminal behavior. And if you take a low-income student and put in a program with a lot of high-income students, that is the one that's going to reduce criminal behavior 10 years later. All right? So what's the implication of all this research? It's basically, it highlights the importance of public investment in higher education, and not only in quantity of higher education, but quality of higher education, and the importance of those free tuition policies for those institutions to promote both social mobility and to reduce income inequality. So that's it. Thank you so much.
I better be careful getting up here because I went to the wrong location, the Alumni Center, and I ran back here because I had the wrong location, and I already had broken ribs and very bad hamstrings, so it was very painful, but this training. That was a while ago. Okay, if I can survive. I'm Gundy Kaupins, and we'll be doing a presentation on basically rethinking career guidance. Now, on the screen, we have companies like SAS, and we have Ernst & Young, we have Microsoft, that's not on there. They do specific hiring for autistic individuals. It's pretty cool to do. They think, okay, they're great, they can do computer programming, they can do accounting by definition. They found out it's not perfect. What they found out is that you don't focus, generalize on autism. You focus on specific skills. And we're finding out when you do that focus in companies, autistic professionals are up to 140% more productive than average employees when properly matched with the job. Productive, cost-effective. Companies like Microsoft, instead of doing quick interview, they have a 2-day process that includes interviews. And interviews are the thing that hurt autistic folks the most in terms of getting into jobs. 80% are not employed. So on to the next slide. Now, here's the results of my research, which is, I'm in step 2 of it because I've had other studies on this. I did content analysis of over 300 job lists. What is an autism job list? It's a list of best and worst jobs for autistic individuals. And these job lists come from counseling websites, ouch. They come from autistic organizations, referee journals, books, Temple Grandin, who's the big guru in the autistic area. We have blogs, artificial intelligence, Quora, and Reddit. And the views are typically 10,000 to 120,000, but some are 800,000 views. And these things, I'll show you a little bit about the reliability. Half of the worst jobs listed are also considered as the best jobs in other lists. Reliability, huh? And so these lists, I'm finding out, are horrible also because they provide minimal career advice. And they don't tell you that every autistic individual is an individual. They don't tell you a lot of other services that autistic individuals can deal with. There is no academic support for these lists, but they are becoming a whole lot more popular now, even with counseling centers. You see the most common best jobs and worst jobs for autistic individuals. You see a pattern? Social jobs are no good. They're bad. And the best jobs for autistic individuals, based on one model we have, are investigative jobs. Do the research. The worst are social by far. Enterprising, oh, can't be entrepreneurs. Don't want to be like you. Definitely not. And then realistic, what does that mean? Do physical labor. Like, I can't walk around, otherwise I'll break my ribs. How about that? But this is a severe problem that is center to a lot of autistic organizations. It's really rough, and that happens. Now, I've sent this research study off to Autism Journal, and I also am sending the research to practitioner journals in autism. Every journal article, in my opinion, should also go to some practitioner autism places. Now, in terms of future research, the definition of autism is incomplete, according to the American Psych Association. So I'm going more into those biases and analyze what's out there. And finally, going to go and research companies to see how their programs to diversify are working. What specific things work? I'll tell you one thing, be specific. Be specific to their skills, and you're going to do a good job. I'm done. I'm exhausted, and if I can get back, I'll be good. Made it. Okay.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. It's really nice to see all of your faces out there in the audience. My name is Nicole Holden, and I'm an accounting information systems teacher here at Boise State. And today I'm going to talk about my research, and it's on Minding the Gap, how ESG reporting readiness and integration impact business and society. So when I came up with this idea, I was thinking about all the different disclosure rules that are coming out right now, like the 2024 SEC disclosure rules, the EU CSRDs, and different disclosure rules in California. And I was thinking about the difference between companies and their behavior and then advisors and their behavior. So companies believe that they're super prepared and they're really ready for these regulations, and advisors don't think so. So that's what I found in my research. And why does this really matter? Well, it means that there's going to be incomplete disclosure out there, specifically about environmental, social, and governance disclosures. And it's going to increase possible compliance pitfalls and maybe reduce trust with stakeholders or outside entities. So beyond being just like a regulatory checklist, this ESG disclosure looks at business risk, and it really helps you as business leaders look at business risk within your companies, not only associated with ESG, but associated with a lot of other different departments. And we found this through our interviews. It also has broad societal impacts, and not only does it impact risk and risk management, it also impacts strategy. So business strategy, how you guys look at risks, not only again about ESG risks, but risks in general across all of your businesses and business departments. So the other thing I want to highlight here is for policymakers. They want reliable data, right? They want frameworks with reliable data, and then from that, they want transparent and credible disclosures. So this paper actually alludes to some things that policymakers can do in order to have better disclosure outcomes. And then for the community at large, we want climate resilience overall and to uphold human rights, and we also want economic growth in our community, especially here in Boise. Can we do the second slide? Oh, I'll do it. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I interviewed 32 business professionals, and 17 of them were firm individuals, and 11 of them were from companies, and 4 of them were board of directors. And it was really interesting to hear all their different opinions about ESG disclosure. So I had them rank from 1 to 5 their ESG readiness, and companies, as I said before, are really totally sure that they're ready for these ESG disclosures, and advisors are like, hey, wait a minute, no, you're not. So we wanted to look in, why does this happen? So it's not just one department doing these ESG disclosures, it's an enterprise-wide collaboration. And it's not just data, ESG data, it's data throughout your whole enterprise. So it's HR, finance, supply chain, and it's integrating all of this data. And it's not just technical solutions. So it's not just gathering data, it's thinking about it in different ways. So we found 4 best practices, which are cross-departmental collaboration, so not having them in silos, supply chain and ERM integration, customizing the approach so there's no one-size-fits-all for each business, and then strong leadership buy-in. So it really matters, the tone at the top, if the CEO is in on ESG, if the board's in on ESG or not. So I just wanted to point out that collaboration with community partners like you guys out there is really important for us as academic researchers. We can co-develop strategies together, and we can find out solutions to problems that you might be having at your jobs or businesses. And we can create sustainable value together for Boise in general. So I look forward to your questions in a little bit. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Kroes. I'm a supply chain professor, and so I've got my 5-minute shot clock. I'm starting right here so I can keep track. When Ryan said Rafael was the leadoff, I'm like, oh no, that makes me the cleanup hitter. So I'm either gonna strike out, hit a home run, or get intentionally walked. But you're probably wondering, like, what's a supply chain professor doing talking about patient care? Our major covers a lot of areas. One of those is quality improvement, process improvement. So this kind of falls into that piece of it. Also, my wife is a doctor, and this project that I'm doing with Regis Turpin, who's also supply chain faculty here at BSU, and our friend Christian Rossetti, who's at Georgia Southern, has been going on for about 8 or 9 years. So we've been working on it for a while, and it's ongoing. It's resulted in a couple publications. But what we did when we undertook this, we started talking to people, and they're like, we get all these free-form comments from patients, but we don't do anything with it. And a lot of doctors are very skeptical of what people post on like Health Grades or some of these online sites. We said that's a lot of data. Let's jump into it and see if we can get some value from it. So we did a technique. It's called manifest text analysis. So we took a huge sample of about 4,000 patient reviews, all from Idaho. So this is kind of Idaho specific. And using some software, we found patterns of words that occur frequently together. And these evolved as themes. And when you start looking at them, you could kind of look at them and say, well, this theme kind of fits this category, this fits that category. And we use that then to see how do those themes relate to patient satisfaction, looking at the rating that those reviewers gave the provider. That was kind of phase one. And then phase two was we did what's called a Keynote analysis or Keynote analysis. It's where you look at what is required by a healthcare organization as kind of basic requirements by patients. What are things that always improve patient satisfaction, and what are the extra things they do that result in patients being delighted? So if we flip to the next slide, I can show you the themes that came out of this text analysis. We came out with a number of themes and things like scheduling. Patients who mentioned scheduling-related keywords like minute, appointment, month, day, hospital, frequently together, tend to be very unhappy. So in scheduling condition, as you know. Also, things like rude staff. Anytime they talked about the doctor being rude, not good. Another one, very negative, was when the doctor seemed focused on money, getting more money, extra treatments. But then there were positive things like being good with children, just overall doing a great job. And when they talked about like, I would recommend this doctor to a family or a friend, that correlated very highly with positive reviews. So what was really cool then, my wife being a doctor, is she had a bunch of comments from her clinic. She works for the, it used to be Family Medicine Residency of Idaho, now it's Full Circle Health. So they had thousands of comments from all their clinics. So my sabbatical project a few years ago was to analyze all those comments and give them a report kind of clinic by clinic. If you want to flip over, here is the model we built though, using kind of what we developed. If you can make it full screen, it's hard to see. It's basically an Excel program. Anybody who works for a not-for-profit health organization we use for free, all you do is just copy and paste your comments into a sheet on there, and it generates a report and says, well, based on your comments, your typical patient has like a 51.2% chance of being satisfied versus unsatisfied. And you can see which themes you do really want. So it's a really cool, easy-to-use tool. And then flipping back to the slides, diving deeper into our themes. Oh. That's okay. We identified what are the things that companies have to do, to meet that basic level of expectations for customers. And they were all the negative things, and we reverse coded it. So they should not be rude. They should do a good job at scheduling. They should actually treat what they're supposed to treat. And then things that resulted, I want to jump off the stage here, being professional, they were what we call delighters, having good bedside manner, showing knowledge related to things that customers were delighted with. It made them give really high reviews. So really cool project, very applicable. We would be excited to talk to anybody in healthcare to see if there's any opportunities for collaboration. And with that, I've got 20 seconds left, so I'm going to yield the rest of my time. But thank you very much.
I think it's my turn. Hi, everyone. I'm Felice Klein, and I'm going to be presenting a paper on the gender equity gap. Do I just use this? Okay. So you've probably heard of the gender pay gap, right? Everyone's heard of it. Most of the previous research on the gender pay gap focuses on traditional forms of pay, salary, bonuses, those more traditional. Very few studies have focused on other forms of pay, which employees tend to receive a lot of. So in this paper, we wanted to look at one of the main forms that happens in a number of organizations, particularly tech, startups, for leaders in leadership roles. We wanted to look at equity-based awards. This also has huge wealth implications for employees. And so we wanted to understand two main questions in this paper. Does a gender gap exist in equity-based awards? And two, why? To do this, we actually did a multi-method study. So we started off with interviews with HR practitioners, HR executives from a variety of companies to understand various things like, why do you give out equity? How are you doing it? What are the processes? We also collaborated with organizations to get this data. So we, as you can see here on the screen, we did 4 studies in this project. 2, we were able to obtain personal record data from organizations. A private tech startup, which had about 250 employees, as well as a publicly traded tech firm that had about 3,000 employees. We also, to study these questions, did an experiment, which I won't get into the nitty-gritty details. You can ask me for the paper after if you're interested. And we also looked at proxy statements to understand executive pay. And so what did we find? We found about a 15 to 30% gap between men and women in equity-based awards. These are stock and stock options. This is even after accounting for some of the main reasons women tend to earn less. They're in lower paid occupations, maybe they have lower tenure. We accounted for all of that. And we found a 15 to 30% gap, as you can see, depending on the sample, that second column, between men and women in the number of grants they receive, as well as the value. After that, we wanted to understand why. And so in our interviews, we heard some of the main reasons why equity is given out to employees is retention concerns. We want to keep certain employees. We want to retain our top performing employees. And so we sought to understand, does that explain the gender gap in equity-based awards? And across the studies we did, we actually found evidence. We did an experiment. We found evidence in the granting of female to male employees, if it was based on retention. And then we also found the gap only in refresh grants. For those who are familiar, maybe in organizations, those tend to be given out for retention versus the initial hire grants. So next slide. So what does this mean for organizations? Well, so the one other thing I forgot to mention on the last slide is we also obtained salary information and bonus information. And what we found by looking at these companies, there were small to no gaps in salary and bonuses. So these organizations were doing things to address the gaps in these more traditional forms of pay. And they were working. Things like voluntary pay audits, transparency, formalization, reducing subjectivity were all things that they were doing. Those were reducing the gaps in bonuses and salary, but they weren't applying them for equity-based awards. So one of the main implications is what organizations are doing to address gaps is working, but it needs to be applied to all forms of pay that employees receive. And then the second thing is, if you are a stakeholder interested in these ideas, interested in closing gender inequality, you need to push organizations, policies that address all forms of pay, not just the more traditional forms of pay. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Andrew Smyth. There's a Y where the I should be. I'm in the Department of Economics here at Boise State. And I'm going to share just a little bit about some of the research that I'm working on related to innovation. Okay. You can see here, these are some questions that all relate to papers, research projects that I've either completed, that I'm currently working on, or that I'll be turning kind of full attention to very shortly. Okay. Just zooming out for a second, big picture, you might wonder, what is an academic economist who's looking at innovation? Like, what big picture are the types of questions that individual, someone like me, would be interested in? So I would say that I'm interested in private company policies, public government policies, how these policies can affect innovation, okay? What types of data do economists typically use who are looking at innovation? Well, often we try to get data on innovation expenses. So think of like research and development expenses, for example. And then also information on innovation outcomes. And in particular, oftentimes we use patent data for this purpose, okay? I just have a little bit of time, so let me just talk a little bit more about a couple of these projects. So starting at the top there, do research tax credits affect innovation? Beginning in the early 1980s in the US, a number of states started introducing state-level research and development tax credits, okay? including Idaho, actually. So with this project, my co-author and I, we were interested in a very simple question. Did these state-level R&D tax credits actually work? Did they increase innovation in the types of ways that the policymakers that enacted the credits were anticipating, okay? So we look at almost 3 decades of innovation outcomes with these credits, about 30 states that enacted these credits, and we actually find that no, it doesn't seem like the credits actually affected innovation in the way that the policymakers probably intended, okay? One more, the second one there. So did deregulation bolster research collaboration? As you might be aware, in the late 70s and early 80s in the US, there's another paper kind of looking at the 1980s, just by happenstance. There was lots of deregulation in the US, okay? It affected many industries. In particular, because of deregulation, the cost of a long distance telephone call and the cost of passenger air travel really decrease, okay? So what we're interested in with this project is, did these decreases in what you might think of as communication costs, okay, the cost of making a long distance telephone call or visiting someone in another state to collaborate on research, did these price decreases lead to more research collaboration at a distance or more remote research collaboration? Concrete example, Xerox in those days had a lot of researchers in upstate New York. They also famously had researchers in Silicon Valley at their Park research lab, okay? So if you're working, let's say at Park, and all of a sudden it's cheaper to make a phone call, okay, to one of your colleagues at Xerox in upstate New York, or it's cheaper to get on a plane and go visit them, are you more likely to engage in a research collaboration with them? And what we find is that yes, these decreases in communication costs increase research collaboration, okay? Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to get into some of these other projects, but hopefully the list here of these questions just kind of gives you a flavor of what someone like me who is interested in innovation and approaching it from kind of a economics perspective, the types of questions, I think very policy relevant questions that we ask, okay? And just in closing, if you were to ask kind of what makes an academic economist who is looking at innovation, what's something unique that we bring to the table as opposed to maybe someone in another discipline or someone in the private sector who's interested in innovation, I would say that it's our obsession with causation, okay? Probably not surprised, Rafael, also in the economics department, mentioned correlation is not causation, okay? So economists who look at innovation, we have a rather sophisticated toolkit that we employ to try to make sure that when we're asking questions like this, that we're getting answers that reflect causation and not just simply correlation. All right, thank you for your time.
Hello, everyone. My name is Niusha Jones. I'm in the marketing department here at Boise State. The research that I will be presenting today is on how setbacks affect our preferences, how setbacks affect our choices. This paper was my work with my colleague here, Dr. Ann Hamby, and another colleague of mine, Dr. Blair Kitbert, University of North Texas, published recently in the Journal of Marketing Research, one of the top 3 journals in the field of marketing, and landed us for the first time in the list of top 100 research institutions for marketing. Specifically, we are 71 right now, ahead of University of Oregon, Florida State, Iowa State, a bunch of other top research institutions. Been featured in NPR, Medium, and other podcasts. The story is fairly simple. Let's imagine that you have a hard day at work. Maybe you missed a deadline. Maybe you had a very tough conversation with your boss. Something happened that made you feel specifically incompetent and powerless. What do you reach for? What brands call to you in that specific moment? That was the story for our research. What we found was that in a specific emotional state that we are talking about, specifically performance failures, people feel they want brands that represent aggression, power, dominance. That's what they choose. Now, what does this mean in terms of marketing? If you have a brand that carries this type of association, your best bet in advertising is not to go with happy, cheerful, successful ads. Capitalize on feelings of loss of power. That's what you need in your ads. That sells way better than anything else that involves success. But for consumers, it's about mindful consumption, understanding what we need in those moments. What's the need that is heightened when we feel powerless? And what are the brands and products that are hopefully healthier for us that we can choose and stay healthy, but also psychologically fulfill that need? Maybe next time when we are struggling with those feelings, instead of reaching for Buffalo Trace, we would reach for bulletproof coffee. So one study that we had here, which was in collaboration with Idaho Liquor, was how Boise State fans, football fans specifically, react to the failures of the team. Because vicariously, team fans, they can experience those feelings. And what we found was that every loss that Boise State had, the sales of more masculine, more aggressive liquor brands would go up. A good example for using this strategy in ads would be the Take on TJ Nike ad. If you haven't watched it, watch it. It's a very light-hearted play that evokes that feelings of incompetence and failure, and then positions Nike as your solution. This could be tested across a variety of products, variety of brands. Could be applicable. It doesn't matter what your product is, what your brand is. You can still use the same strategy and position yourself as that solution, and basically make that setback a connection between you and the consumer. Well, thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, talk to me after the session. Thank you.
What are you going to do? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Ehrlich from the Department of Management, and if Rafael was the leadoff hitter and Jim was the cleanup hitter, I guess I'm the 9 hitter, which, given my baseball career, is not an unfamiliar spot for me. So, not a terrible thing. But speaking of sports, I'm here to talk about my research interest and some of my research that I've conducted over the past few years, which really relates to the legal environment of college sports. And if any of you are interested in college sports, if any of you follow college sports, Boise State, it's a big deal here. You probably know that my research interest keeps me pretty busy these days because there's a lot going on with college sports. There's a lot going on with the future of college sports, with the idea of moving on to a new future of college sports. And really, for the most part, a lot of my research right now is focused around the House settlement. And for those of you who are unaware of the House settlement is a settlement to a class action lawsuit that are 3 class action lawsuits actually that involve the NCAA and the Power 4 conferences. And along with this settlement promising the NCAA and the Power 4 conferences to pay approximately $2.6 billion to athletes, which is quite a lot of money. It also imposes a number of rule changes. It imposes injunctive relief in the form of these rule changes, including allowing athletic departments to share about $20 million per year in revenue with their schools or with the athletes of their schools, kind of this direct revenue sharing. Some may call it pay-for-play salary. The NCAA is adamant that it is not that, but certainly something that you may have heard about with the Built Different campaign that Boise State has started and all of the statements that our athletic director and our athletic department has made regarding this incoming revenue sharing. The House Senate also imposes or creates new scholarship limits or creates new roster limits in place of scholarship limits, which is really kind of an interesting thing where instead of having scholarship limits where beach volleyball, for example, could only have a certain amount of scholarships in kind of their larger roster, they can now have scholarships up to the roster cap. But it's kind of an unintended consequence of this is the fact that a lot of athletes are now being told they don't have spots anymore because we now have hard roster limits where walk-ons who could go beyond the cap before are now being told, well, there's no spot on you in the team anymore. And that's one thing that has led to a lot of objections to the settlement, which the deadline for objections is actually this Friday. So one thing to keep in mind is whether the settlement actually goes through as written. And then third, it would allow the NCAA, and I think this might be of interest to a lot of you, any of you who engage in NIL deals with Boise State athletes, it would allow the NCAA to enforce rules that is long sought regarding third-party NIL, third-party name, image, and likeness deals, and what they see as pay for play, and kind of cutting down on collectives, cutting down on booster payments to college athletes that what they would see as pay for play. But my research interest, and really what I look at in all of this, and what I'm looking at in regards to the House settlement, is what the House settlement does not cover. What is not being said in the House settlement? And this comes into place in the holes in the House settlement. So for example, a legal settlement, as many legal scholars, including myself, has pointed out, only binds the parties to the settlement, only binds the athletes and the schools and the NCAA. It does not bind third parties, so how is that third prong even going to be enforced? And what the House settlement also doesn't do is answer the question about college athlete employment. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals back in this past summer of 2024, issued a decision saying that college athletes may be considered employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. This would be a huge, huge decision for athletic departments across the country who may have to deal with paying minimum wage, dealing with Title VII, all these different legal issues that go into the relationship between employees and employers. So I'm working on an article right now that's kind of looking to unpack this decision, that's looking to say, really, more than anything else, how far does this stretch? The Third Circuit had some really interesting discussion in their case, in their decision, about the so-called Flutie effect, the idea that athletic department success, that a team's success drives a university, pushes a university forward. A feeling that Boise State University well knows, based on the Fiesta Bowl from back when, and how we have grown since then. In fact, Boise State was cited in that decision as one of the primary beneficiaries of this effect. So how far does this go? How far does the idea of an employee athlete go if there is, of course, no federal relief coming from Congress? I'm also looking at continuing antitrust attacks on NCAA governance rules. There was a case also this past fall, Pavia v. NCAA, which essentially picked at the NCAA's ability to even enforce eligibility rules in the first place. It essentially said, well, because athletes are making money now, because athletes have this economic advantage to being a college athlete, how can courts, how can the NCAA stop them from being college athletes and being able to really realize this benefit? So I'm really looking a lot in my research and looking a lot in my writing as to the effects of these cases, as to the continued effects of the various different cases that are not solved by this House settlement that will impact college athletics from year to come. I've also worked a lot in the community on these sort of things. I've had some informal conversations with our athletic department here, kind of giving my more kind of bird's eye perspective on these legal happenings, on these legal events, to kind of pair with the athletic departments more on the ground. It's been a really good collaborative approach. And I've also talked with a lot of parents of walk-on athletes who their sons and daughters have been told, you don't have a spot anymore. And that's all going to lead up to the objection deadline and the eventual final approval hearing on April 7th. And then finally, I've also created a website, the College Sports Litigation Tracker, which really looks to keep everyone updated and looks to keep anyone who's interested updated on all the legal events, all the legal cases involving the NCAA, and how those cases might impact college sports moving forward. So I'm happy to talk with anyone about this. Clearly, I could talk about this for a lot more than 5 minutes. But with that, I'm happy to hand it over to Anne.
And now for a lightning keynote. All right, so the first time I spoke with the media about my research, I had no idea how to prepare. I still don't talk to the media that often, but I still get nervous, and I still probably don't really know how to prepare. But this first time, I got ready like I was going to a doctoral seminar. I read my paper, I knew my methods, I knew my theoretical contributions. So imagine my surprise and lack of preparation when the first question from the journalist was, well, how does your work apply to the real world? Stunned silence, doe in headlights. This is not off to a great start. So the journalist, probably sensing my unease and used to dealing with oblivious green researchers like me, pivoted and asked about the methods. Okay, your methods were a little dense. I had a hard time understanding them. Can you explain them in simple terms? And already nervous, I launch into a 5-minute jargon-laden monologue that probably would have confused even my co-authors. So, needless to say, the interview ended conspicuously early, and I never heard from the journalist again and never saw the article get published. So at least this was a privately embarrassing experience, but it did pop the bubble on the academic world I had primarily been inhabiting up until this point. It might surprise some of the real-world practitioners in this audience to learn that some doctoral programs, at least the one I went to, and things have changed since then, prioritized theoretical advance, and practical relevance could be figured out by other people. But this experience really showed me that not only do people on the outside care about our research, but they want to know concretely how it applies to their lives. And the onus is on us, at least somewhat, to explain it to them. And since this time, I've observed many conversations about real-world relevance in business research. And I do still agree with the words of pioneering psychologist Kurt Lewin that there's nothing as practical as a good theory. But the current business zeitgeist focuses no longer singularly on conceptual advance, but also places emphasis on the dual aims of rigor as well as relevance. Now, in some ways, that raises the bar on what we have to do, right? We don't just have to create knowledge, we also have to make it relevant to everyone as well. But as we have seen today, this is something that is eminently doable. And I think part of the confusion around, or just complication in the conversation about research relevance, stems from understanding of what is research relevance? Relevance to whom? And I don't think it's just relevance to one person or there's a singular definition. I think it's relevance to on several dimensions, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my time here talking about. But first, I want to take a quick detour. So you may or may not have noticed, but I'm expecting a human. And this human is still yet unnamed. And people have told me, that's fine, take your time, you'll come up with a name, but don't name it anything weird, right? Don't name it something like Eric. So I'm just kidding. This is just a memory technique to hopefully help you remember this framework and also get your attention again. So I want to talk a little bit about 5 dimensions of research relevance that correspond broadly with the different phases in the research process. So coming up with a question, collecting the data, and then answering or disseminating the information broadly. And my straightforward conjecture is that research relevance increases to the extent that a research project considers each of these. And we've seen these here today. So first, audience focused. Now, who's your audience? It's probably not journal editors, and as maybe some of the practitioners in the audience know, but maybe you don't, there's this whole thing called the peer review process, where we have to struggle and jump through hoops and convince our peers that our work is really important and theoretically sound and rigorous before it actually even makes its way out into the real world. So it's natural that academics are going to focus a little bit, maybe on some of their immediate audience, but really, there's a broader audience out there. Is it policymakers? Is it practitioners? Is it students? Is it consumers, right? So thinking about that will obviously guide the shape of the research project. And not to go marketing 101, but obviously people want different products. And so products are designed to appeal to those needs. And so consequently, research projects should also appeal to the interests of audiences. Now, we saw this with Gundy's article, and you guys are going to love my AI filters here. A little noir. Gundy's project focused on biases towards autistic individuals in the workplace. And my at least inferred audience for his work are career counselors and individuals who are hiring autistic individuals. If he'd focused on, say, policymakers, his work might have taken a different form. Now, it's not enough to focus on an audience. You actually have to ask questions that are important to that audience. So I've done plenty of research that no practitioner would care about. In my area on narrative persuasion, so how stories influence the beliefs and behaviors of consumers, one research project I did looked at two cognitive processes that are common in this field: narrative transportation, the extent to which you're pulled into the story, and character identification, the extent to which you see the story through the eyes of the consumer. Are those distinct processes that can be manipulated independently? Well, no one in practice cares about this because they often co-occur. So this was a project that was targeted directly at academics. So if I wanted to do something a little bit more relevant to broader society, I would have asked a different question, like Nicole did. Dr. Nicole Holden's work on ESG and sustainability posed questions that businesses, policymakers are currently grappling with right now. Same thing with Dr. Ehrlich's work, examining the House versus NCAA settlement, looks at things that colleges, Boise State specifically, and student athletes care about because it impacts how revenue from sporting events are shared, who gets a slice of the pie. Now then, moving along to actually collecting the data. So my pretty straightforward stance here is that when we can have independent variables or predictor variables or look at the influence of things in our studies in a way that mimics how they actually occur in the real world, surprise, this increases research relevance. And you might be going, well, that's obvious, right? But you'd be surprised. Take a look at some of the top tier journals, at least in my field, and you will see advertisements that no kindergartner would mistake for the real thing, or plenty of scenario studies where people are asked to imagine they're about to buy a car. Right? So, to what extent does this really generalize outside? So aligning your independent variables in the way that they actually appear in life, in the real world, increases research relevance. And we saw this with Dr. Niusha Jones' work, where she looked at actual failure ads. She ran them on actual ad networks and looked at how people responded, right? Rather than in a lab type study with an ad that definitely would not pass for the real thing. And same thing with Dr. Felice Klein's work, looking at the influence of gender on equity-based awards, right? Gender is very practical, and we can measure that, and that is something that no one's going to mistake for. It's a very realistic independent variable. And then going hand in hand with the realistic IVs are the impactful dependent variables, right? How are you measuring the impact of your work on an outcome measure? And we see this with our economists, Andrew Smyth and Rafael Ribas. I'm remembering correlation is not causation. It's a mantra here. But, so Andrew looked at the impact on actual patents that were generated. And Rafael looked at the impact of free tuition on things like crime rates and eventual earnings, right? So these are actual real-world outcomes. Now, one thing that, again, maybe the practitioners in the field or in this audience don't know, sometimes academics have to resort to things like willingness to pay or perceptual measures because we have a hard time accessing actual data. So if there's anyone in here who's seen any of these presentations earlier and are thinking, whatever, that's kind of like related to my context, and you have data that you're willing to supply, this would really help us bridge this boardroom and the real world. So I'll make that plug there. And then finally, we've got our research project done. We've got hopefully results that are worth sharing with the outside world. It's really sad if you don't. That happens though. Anyway, you've got to disseminate them, right? You've got to communicate them. And oftentimes for academics, this happens in journal format. But it can take a number of formats as well. So practitioner journals, we've heard that mentioned. Jim mentioned his spreadsheet. And even when writing academic articles, we can write them in a way that does not have this dense prose that, sometimes I sit down and read these articles and cannot get through them. We can use concrete examples. We can use language that is less jargon laden. We can use vivid images. We can even hire copy editors to help us sometimes. So as I mentioned earlier, Jim, not only did he disseminate his work to, more traditional outlets, but also practitioner-oriented outlets, and used Google Notebook, to create a podcast. So if you're interested, ask him for the link, and you can hear his handiwork. So as I reflect back on my less than stellar media experience earlier on, it strikes me that I really could have learned a lot from my colleagues here at COBE. This framework that I've briefly spun through is not only not the name of my unborn child, but it's also not just an academic exercise, right? It's really hopefully a call for us to all focus on who is the audience of our work? What are the questions they care about? How can we ground our variables in realism? And how can we communicate it in a way that actually people can understand? Because as academics, we not only have the opportunity to make an impact on public policy, practice, public perception, students, but we really have to take those extra steps to make that difference and bridge between what we're doing and the outside world. And so I know I'm kind of the closer here, so I want to plant an icebreaker if anybody needs it. So for the folks on the COBE board, the practitioners in the audience, ask an academic how long it took for their last project to get published, how many years, and what years, plural, how many, and the barriers they encountered in the review process, because there are many dragons to slay. And then for us academics, maybe we can ask the practitioners, how can we make our work more relevant to you? And if you have any data to share with us.
I'd like to invite all the presenters to come up here. We're going to applaud for you, but we're also going to take a picture of you together, so please come. Really appreciate Anne closing that up. The presentations were awesome. Again, this is the first of maybe many, perhaps, where we're going to make a concerted effort to help people understand the value of research and its impact it can have, and hopefully create some new collaborations. So thank you for being here.